Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us tonight for our broadcast. We're going to be focusing on the road to civil war today, but then again, we need to go ahead and kind of see where people are. Make sure to go ahead and get your questions in, okay? So let me go ahead and put so what are y'all studying this week? Okay, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put pre 1850. Okay, you haven't gotten to the compromise of 1850 yet. 1850 to 1860. And what we'll do here is Civil War, Reconstruction, and then post 1877. All right, so I've got a poll here. We're going to go ahead and get that in there. All right, so a poll is there. So let's go ahead and answer the poll. Ask your questions, okay? Go ahead and answer the poll. Ask your questions, all of that good stuff, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll go ahead and pull up some stuff that I can talk about in the absence of questions if it's going to be looking like that, okay? So as far as that goes, yes, go ahead, answer the poll and ask your questions, okay? I'm here. You've got me here for an hour, so let's go ahead and make the most of it. Okay, good. We've got a question coming in. We need more. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get this open here. And let's see where people are right now. All right, so based on the poll here. All right, so it looks like the majority of you are studying the Civil War right now. Let's see if some other responses come in. So a lot of people are actually on the Civil War, which that's fine. If you want to ask questions about the Civil War, that is fine as well. Okay, so whatever it is, we don't have to stay on the topic of the night. I'm here to help you to answer whatever questions you have. So right now it looks like we do have looks like about 60% of y'all here are studying the Civil War, and then some of y'all are in this 1850, 1860 period, and then some people are before that. All right, so the Emancipation Proclamation. All right. So yes, I'll be glad to do that. Okay, these look great. So it looks like our discussion is going to be focusing more on the thing here. Okay, so as far as that goes, let me go ahead and let's see. Advice for answering tough multiple choice. Okay, there's something on my website. There's a handout called the Ritchie Doctrine, and I'm going to go ahead and put that. I'll go ahead and put a link here into our conversation. Okay, so as far as that goes, if anybody's wanting some advice on multiple choice, we've got that. All right, so as far as that goes, now remember, ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead. We want to make sure that we're posting questions, okay? Do I have anything on DBQs? Yes, if you go to YouTube and you look up APUSH DBQ, you will see my DBQ video. I've got a 3-part DBQ video, and I've also got my 8-month writing clinic if you want something more in depth. But yes, I do have a video on the DBQ. So as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, what leads to the Great Famine of 1845 to 1850? Now, of course, Annie, we're getting out of the United States at that time. Now, all you really need to know about the Great Famine is that it happened, and that, of course, is in Ireland. So the Irish potato famine was a causal factor in the wave of Irish immigration during the antebellum period. And remember that as far as that goes, okay, so we're talking about the mid-19th century, what immigration groups were coming in and what were their motives. Now, as far as that goes, the main group coming in, the biggest group coming in at that time was the Irish. And of course, that was due to the famine that they had. Now, there were also a lot of German immigrants. They called these people 48ers, that because if any of y'all have taken AP Euro, this is not something you need to know for U.S. history, but during that time, around the 1840s, the revolutions of 1848, there was a lot of upheaval in Europe and especially in the German states. And there were people people coming from that area and settling in the United States to avoid the unrest in Europe. But the largest group, okay, the largest group at that time would have been the Irish. Now, the other thing about the Irish is today, of course, if you think about the Irish, you know, population is really a lot of it in New York and Massachusetts. So the Irish tended to stay in the cities, whereas Germans tended to go inland. A lot of these Germans wanted to farm, whereas the Irish were more likely to try to get labor jobs in the cities, which of course ticked off a lot of native laborers as well, because that was driving down wages. Now, in the Midwest, that's why there are so many people of German ancestry in the Midwest, because a lot of these German settlers, they would go inland. Their objective was to start farms in the Midwest. So Irish and German immigrants, even though German immigrants are kind of coming into the United States from the colonial period, you know, all the way through the late 19th century. So their motives, of course, they're getting away from civil unrest, and of course, in the Irish, you know, with the Irish starvation in Europe, and so they're looking for opportunities in, you know, in the United States. And you know, with the Irish, of course, there was also the Catholic thing. Okay, so remember that before the wave of Irish immigration during the antebellum period, the United States was easily like 90+% Protestant. Okay, not just Christian, but the United States was very, very heavily Protestant. And so this was really the first wave of Catholic immigration, which that caused problems as well, because, you know, the United States was a very Protestant country. Now, if you think about the United States today, the United States is about 75%, about 75% of Americans identify to some extent or another as Christian. And of those, about half of Americans identify with some sort of Protestant denomination, whereas about 25% of Americans identify as Catholic. So in our country today, we've got about 2 Protestants for every Catholic. And then, but if you go back before the 1840s, you're looking at 90% Protestant and maybe about 5% Catholic. And so that was a big shock, of course. And that's typically when people, you know, respond negatively to immigration, that has to do with some sort of religious factor, cultural factor, or an economic factor, such as the cheap labor. Okay, so that's, and then remember, the Know Nothing Party was organized in response to that. And so the importance of the border states in the Civil War. Now, before that, let me go ahead and take a quick look at this Crittenden Compromise. Okay, now the thing is that the Crittenden Compromise is not something that you're really going to, I don't see it coming up on the AP, like there being anything that's going to call upon you to actually know that on the exam, even though it could possibly be used as evidence in an open-ended question. I mean, that is certainly possible. But the thing is, like today on my YouTube channel, I did, in case anybody's not familiar with that, most people that show up here are, but youtube.com Tom Ritchie, I just put up a new video on the Compromise of 1850, and I also did a little rap. So that's there as well if you want to hear the rap, the Compromise of 1850 rap going through the 5 provisions. Now, the reason why the Compromise of 1850 is on the exam is because that's a compromise that actually happened. Okay, that's a compromise that actually happened, whereas the Crittenden Compromise was a proposed compromise. So to the extent that the Crittenden Compromise would ever be something that you would put on a DBQ, LEQ, SAQ, this could be an example of a failed attempt to compromise. Now, Crittenden was from Kentucky, the same place as Henry Clay. And so this is what we need to kind of understand, that you've got slave states and free states, but then you've got like the cotton states in the Deep South that have their own interests. They've got a lot higher percentage of slaves than the states in what we call the Upper South or the border states. And so in Kentucky, you know, whereas in Mississippi or South Carolina, you're looking at about 45% to 48% slave population, whereas in Kentucky you're looking at only about 20 to 25%. And so there are, easily 3 to 4 people for every enslaved person in Kentucky. And so Kentucky's really kind of got a foot in both camps. And so, like Henry Clay, Crittenden tried to come up with proposals such as, how about we just extend the Missouri Compromise line regarding slavery all the way to the Pacific, and stuff like that. But you don't need to know the details of it. In fact, a lot of times I have to look those up. But it was a failed attempt at compromise. Now, remember, when Lincoln took office, Lincoln said that I am not compromising on the Republican platform. So when the Republican platform said free soil, now Lincoln wasn't going to come after slaves in the South. He made that very clear, that the Republican Party platform in 1860 made no, it had nothing, no problem, had no problem with slavery where it was. So Lincoln was not going to go after slavery in Alabama. Okay, so that's not what he's doing. But he's saying slavery in the West, not happening at all. Okay, so Lincoln drew a line there, was not going to compromise. And so the Crittenden Compromise kind of fell on deaf ears. And the point was to try to keep the South from seceding, but the Deep South had already made up its mind to secede. And so, the Crittenden Compromise did not accomplish its purpose. So as far as that goes, let me go ahead and okay, so as far as that, Brady, the most important thing, I would say, to me, the most important thing about this course is Jefferson versus Hamilton and understanding those two outlooks. I think that reverberates through American society. Now, just to be clear, we see that the poll, I'm looking at the poll again, and it looks like more than, so we've got about, let's see, so we've got about 17, 9 plus 8 is 7. We've got about 19 people that have answered the poll, and 9 of y'all are on the 1850, 1860. So if you're on 1850, 1860, make sure to submit some questions, because most of the questions I have are about the Civil War. So now we've got a majority of you are studying 1850 to 1860. Pre-Civil War. Somebody actually just switched their vote, I think. So as far as that goes, all the questions I was seeing earlier are about the Civil War. So if you want me to address this 1850, 1860 period, make sure that y'all submit those questions. All right. So, and yes, remember, submit them as questions, and then they get voted up. All right, so let me see what we've got here, and so going back a little bit for those of you who haven't gotten 1850, who were the most important abolitionists? Okay, now I think that the most important abolitionist was William Lloyd Garrison, and I call these boxes. Okay, the way that I remember history is I make like brain boxes, and so I've got my abolitionism box, and so William Lloyd Garrison, The Liberator. All right. So William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator. Then, so he was a newspaperman and really was kind of the father of the abolitionist movement, the first one to come around in the 1830s and to say that, like, before that, like in the 1820s, William Lloyd Garrison had addressed the American Colonization Society. But the American Colonization Society was just kind of like, okay, we're trying to do our part, but we're not trying to destabilize the country. Now, William Lloyd Garrison, when he published The Liberator in the early 1830s, that is when, that's where he's saying, like, look, we want to get rid of slavery now, and we want to get rid of it everywhere, and we don't care what it does to the nation's economy or society or anything like that, that God says slavery is wrong, and in the spirit of the Second Great Awakening, if something's wrong, then we're not going to be able to do it. And so we need to get rid of this. No union with slaveholders. And so William Lloyd Garrison gets this whole thing started. Now, next, I would say Frederick Douglass. Now, remember Douglass with 2 S's at the end. And Frederick Douglass was a man who had escaped from slavery and also was a great orator. And he really came on the scene after he escaped. He wrote a narrative, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, mistaken, it has been 200 years since Frederick Douglass was born. There's an edition of his narrative that was actually published this year to mark the 200th anniversary of his birth. And so Frederick Douglass, also an orator, so he went around speaking and wrote about it. Okay, so another one that I might mention would be David Walker and David Walker's appeal. Okay, now David Walker's appeal was a basically, it was written to encourage slave rebellions. Now, this wasn't necessarily all abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison was a pacifist. He was not encouraging slave rebellions. William Lloyd Garrison was encouraging a peaceful, abolition of slavery. But David Walker ended up by, just David Walker's appeal is basically saying, look, I mean, you're going to have to fight this with violence. And then, of course, when you get in the 1850s, John Brown would be another person that you would want to know, Bleeding Kansas, and of course, Harper's Ferry. So if you have to come up with evidence for abolition, those are the people that I would note on that. Okay, so thank you so much for that, Perla. All right. Now, as far as that goes, Annie, when we talk about the effects of native peoples with the annexation, all that, you're going to get more into that to the extent that you will. I typically teach that after the Civil War, because really when the Mexican cession is annexed, then, you're not it's not like everybody's going over there at once. It's annexed and barely anybody's over there. And then it is after the Civil War that you start to see, of course, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. And then we see, everybody going out west. And then you see the Indian Wars. And so as far as that goes in the Southwest, there was a Helen Hunt Jackson who wrote A Century of Dishonor. She wrote about this stuff in detail. She was something of a muckraker. You'll learn that term later on when you get to the Progressive Era. So a muckraker, is somebody that is exposing corruption. And so you see the Apache Wars, Wounded Knee, so there is basically a lot of these Indian tribes who were on their ancestral lands that, well, there's some gold and silver on those, or we need to bring the railroad through those. And so they'd be taken off their lands and put on the reservations. Now, not to mention the building of the Transcontinental Railroad that started to, people were hired. Like Buffalo Bill Cody was actually hired by the railroad to shoot buffalo so that the railroad workers could eat. All right. So there were so many buffalo in the Great Plains that they had people just shoot them. And that's what the railroad workers will eat. They could feed themselves. But then again, as you're shooting all the buffalo, the Plains Indians, that was their food. And then once the trains start running, then the buffalo were a new problem because, well, we can't, you'd have to stop a train. Like if a buffalo herd was coming across the tracks, you would have to stop the train perhaps for a few hours. I actually just read Around the World in 80 Days, which was published in the 1870s. And very interesting looking at that book because part of it, they're going through the United States. And you've got this buffalo herd that's going through and the train has to stop for 2 hours because, can't do it. Now, also, if you didn't see them, then, that could make a mess. And so what happened was there was pretty much a systematic killing of these buffalo. And so that was something that destroyed the lifestyles of the Plains Indians. Now, what you make of that is up to you. I mean, certainly it's just when these two cultures collided, with the addition of the railroad, they couldn't both exist. And so, of course, that's one of the tragedies of that. Do I need to know this for the AP test? It would really depend. That's the thing that, as far as that goes, let me go take a look at, let me look at the course description real quick, and I'll tell you exactly what it says there as far as that. So let's see. Now, you do need to know about the transcontinental, so we see here, let's see, where would we find? Okay, I'm just looking through for Indians and I'm on period 2 here. Let's see. So I'm looking to see how that goes when we go into the so-called period 5. Let's see. Okay, let's see. So this is 1865 to 1898. Many American Indians preserved their culture and tribal identities despite government policies promoting assimilation, and they attempted to develop self-sustaining economic practices. The U.S. government violated treaties with American Indians and responded to resistance with military force, eventually confining American Indians to reservations and denying tribal sovereignty. So yes, in response to your question, Perla, we do see this in the APUS history course description as far as the impact of, you know, wide expansion and settlement into the West. So that's definitely something that we would need to know there. All right. And as far as the most important thing to know about on the AP test, like I said, I think understanding like the whole Jefferson versus Hamilton and these traditions where, you know, one side says, hey, I want to farm. I want the government to stay out of my life. I want to read the Constitution strictly. And then another side that says, hey, I want the government to invest in the economy and all of that sort of thing. And then that really kind of reverberates into the second party system, whereas you've got Jackson, who is much more of a Jeffersonian sort of mindset, and then Clay, who is much more Hamiltonian. So that would be what I would say there. All right. So as far as that goes, could I talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin? Okay. So you're welcome, Brady. Uncle Tom's Cabin, okay, a book by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I often compare this. Now tell me, are y'all still familiar with the Twilight movies and books, or is that a thing of the past? Y'all tell me in the chat. Is Twilight still a thing that y'all can understand? But not whether you like Twilight, but do you get the reference? Okay, that's what I'm wondering. Do you get the reference to Twilight? Okay, and no, nope, and no. Okay, so some of y'all do. Anyway, like when I was growing up, vampires were scary. It was like Count Dracula, like, ha 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 ha, they're going to suck your blood or whatever. And so, as far as that goes, that when I was growing up, like if I were to run into a vampire, like I would run, okay, or I would try to put a stake through its heart, give it some garlic or something like that, okay. And so, as far as that goes, I was afraid of vampires when I was growing up. But then you look at the Vampire Diaries, the Twilight Saga, all of this other stuff, and all of a sudden it's like now, like if my daughter runs into a vampire, God forbid, she's going to be like, is he one of the good ones? I wonder, he's so good looking and he's so nice, and maybe I can make him feel more human or something like that. And, people have these ridiculous notions today that vampires may or may not be dangerous. And why is that? Why have people changed their mind about vampires? Y'all tell me in the chat. What is it that has changed this generation's mind that no longer thinks that vampires are inherently dangerous? The cute actors, okay. Yeah, so the vampires are cute. They make them look cute. I'd blame literature. Okay, so there you go, Lily. So the thing is that, slavery is something that, we only really know what it is that we see and experience. And yes, media can definitely change people's minds about things, okay? And so as far as this goes, I tell you, there's something that I saw on Twitter, and let me see if I've got if I can find this this thing that I just retweeted a little while ago. It shouldn't be hard. All right, so as far as that goes, let me show you this here. All right, so let me get in here and open this up. All right, let me share this. All right. Are y'all all in the same class? Y'all are talking like y'all are very familiar with each other. Take a look at this here. This guy says that here is George Washington with a bow and arrow pictured alongside the goddess of America. Now, this is from some Japanese thing that was published, a Japanese illustrated history of America, published in 1861. And so the thing is, this doesn't look like very much like George Washington, and that doesn't look very much like America. But the thing is, people know what they've seen and what they read. And so before Uncle Tom's Cabin, like your average person up north, they might think like, you know what? I mean, I don't own slaves, and slavery is not something I would say like, yay, or something like that. But perhaps perhaps when you think about it, it's like then they'd never read a book. They had never been exposed to it. And so Harriet Beecher Stowe, okay, so Harriet Beecher Stowe writes this book, and all of a sudden it's like you read a book. How many of you've read a book? I mean, I'm sure that you've read a book before that has changed your mind about something and given you a new frame of reference. You have read a book. All right, so as far as that kind of thing, yeah, let's try to keep the chat relevant, ladies and gentlemen, as much as possible, but I understand if y'all want to have a little fun too. As long as y'all are appropriate, we're good. But Uncle Tom's Cabin like really humanized this experience of slavery for a lot of people. And so, they started to think like, this is pretty awful and this happens in our country. And so as far as that is concerned, that's the effect. All right, that Abraham Lincoln, I think when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, it said that you're the woman who started this war, is what he told her, because her book had such an impact on Northern public opinion and turned a lot of people in the North against slavery that had really been kind of indifferent about it before. Because if you think about it today, I mean, it's like, we know that our clothes that are made overseas and our phones that are made overseas, that those things aren't made in conditions that we would approve of in the United States, but we use these things anyway. And I think that that's really what Uncle Tom's Cabin, the effect that had on American society. All right, so as far as that goes, let me go ahead and let's start to get into this. Okay, so let's see, the border states in the Civil War. Okay, so what I would say is you've got really, you've got, of course, the free states. Like all the free states remained in the Union during the Civil War. And you've got like these three different groups of slave states. Okay, so first of all, I'll definitely address the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, remember, the week after Thanksgiving, when we come back, like I'm going to talk about the Civil War again. So it's not like we're going to be, oh, the Civil War's done or something like that. Okay, so we're gonna spend some more time on that, I promise. So as far as that goes, though, you've got the Deep South. Okay, the Deep South, these are the cotton states. These are the ones, you're talking about the original 7 members of the Confederacy: South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Florida. These are states where cotton was the #1 cash crop, and these are also the states that tended to have the highest percentage of slaves. And so then you've got the Upper South. These are, Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina. Now, these states did not join the Confederacy initially when they seceded. The Confederacy initially had only 7 member states. But after the attack on Fort Sumter, then Abraham Lincoln decided, well, I'm going to call for troops. This is a rebellion. So I'm going to call for, I believe, I forget if it was 75 or 90,000, but one of those. I think 75,000 troops for a 90-day enlistment. He says, we're going to put this down. Now, that resulted in Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia joining the Confederacy, okay, basically as a protest measure, that they believed that, they weren't seceding at first, but they weren't going to support an invasion of the South. Now, then you've got the so-called border states, okay, so these are Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And these were the northernmost slave states, all right, the northernmost slave states, which, when you think about it, now there's a little bit of, I think there, but it's pretty much, I mean, you're looking at, there's kind of a buffer there because it's like the Confederacy, no Confederate state that I can think of course, if you include Virginia, then perhaps because, West Virginia is made later. So Virginia would be the only Confederate state that like bordered a free state. So the border states, these were states that, the slaves typically were 25% or less of the population. And Kentucky actually initially said that they declared neutrality in the Civil War. And, they didn't want to be on either side. But of course, they were kind of pulled into the conflict because the Confederates went into Kentucky. And so that was something that, caused a bit of a ruckus. But the border states, these were the states that did not secede from the Union at all, even after Fort Sumter. So the Union included these 4 slave states, which of course 5 when you add West Virginia, which was created during the Civil War. So instead of adding strength to the Confederacy, they're kind of, I mean, really though, all of those like Missouri and Kentucky, they sent a lot of people to different sides. Like for example, like my ancestors lived in Louisiana, so my ancestors are pretty much exclusively Confederate. Whereas somebody who's from Kentucky, they're likely to have ancestors that fought for the Union and the Confederacy. That their family tree, if you're from any of those border states or Tennessee or West Virginia or even Virginia, you may know some people, some ancestors of yours that fought for either side. Now, if you are from Georgia or Louisiana or something like that, odds are your ancestors are probably exclusively Confederate if your ancestors all came from the South. And so as far as that goes, going into this here, that's an easy one, Ashanti. Did Lincoln free the slaves? Yes. Okay. Now, of course, that's a bit of a long process, okay, because we need to think about how that was done. And that was, of course, the 13th Amendment, the Emancipation Proclamation I can talk about in a bit. All right. So as far as that goes, Dakota, yeah, I would say that would be plenty as far as Jefferson Davis. Now, if you're interested in Confederate history, then maybe that would be a worthy inquiry for you on the side. But typically, you're not going to see a great deal, like a lot of like Confederate history on the AP exam. It's going to focus really on the Civil War itself, the causes, the consequences, and all that. So yes, understanding that Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy, that should be, yeah, there's not really anything like, I don't really talk about Jefferson Davis in particular in my AP U.S. history class. All right. What state was the most controversial? Well, I would say that Texas. Texas is something that you could, say there's great bit of controversy because right after their war for independence in the 1830s, Texas applied for admission into the Union. They wanted to come into the United States, and the United States just kind of ignored them for a while because they didn't want to have the internal drama. And of course, the election of 1844 was about, the election of 1844 was between James K. Polk and Henry Clay, and that election was on this idea of manifest destiny. So as far as that goes, all right. So I would say, yeah, Texas was definitely pretty controversial in that sense. And of course, there was Missouri. Not that it was annexed, but when Missouri applied to come into the Union, there was quite a fight over that. All right. You know what, Annie? I'm going to say here, I don't even know what you're talking about there. Now, where did you find this? I'd be curious about that. If you want to put that in the chat, I would have to look that up, which makes me conclude that we probably do not need to, we don't need to know that. The word vigilance never appears in the course description for AP US history. So that's another, yeah, but I would say I wouldn't worry about that unless you're having to do an identification for your class or something like that. In that case, worry about that. All right. Did Lincoln campaign originally for getting rid of slavery completely? No. Lincoln was, before the war and even in his early years as president, a free soiler. It wasn't until the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln expressed any public interest in freeing slaves. Okay, because remember, see, that's another thing about the border states, if we want to think about that, that if Lincoln had said anything. Now, of course, the thing is about Lincoln is that we don't have a lot of private records from Lincoln. So one of the big puzzles of Lincoln is that we really don't know his mind and what was going on in his head. We know pretty much like what he said in public with an occasional letter or something like that. But it's not like Jefferson, where a lot of the things that we quote about Jefferson were not things that people would have recognized as Jefferson quotes back in the day, because a lot of the stuff, Jefferson was just a prolific letter writer. And so as far as that goes, Lincoln was a free soiler. He was not campaigning for getting rid of slavery in Alabama, just against expanding slavery in the West. And the 1860 Republican platform did not call for emancipation. It was a free soil platform. Now, were there abolitionists in the Republican Party? Sure, but but as far as that goes, it was not an abolitionist party, that the platform itself was free soil. So the Emancipation Proclamation is a big turning point, because even in Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, where he's trying to persuade the Confederate States of America has already been formed, but they haven't attacked Fort Sumter yet. And Lincoln, his target audience, he's trying to persuade, get the Confederate states to consider coming back into the Union, but also to try to keep other states from seceding. And Lincoln made clear that, like, I plan to enforce the fugitive slave law. I don't have a problem with the so-called Corwin Amendment that is being debated right now. So as far as that goes, so no, Lincoln, at the outset of the war was not an abolitionist. It wasn't until, and then of course the Emancipation Proclamation was put out there as a necessary war measure, not necessarily something that was primarily for, emancipating slaves. And so as far, oh my goodness, Brady. Oh my goodness. Okay. Do I have any theories on it? Now that's Theories, but do I believe 9/11 was an inside job? You know what? I'm just going to go with not on the exam on that one, Brady. All right, y'all, I tell you what, I can't. All right. Could I talk about the Underground Railroad, which was neither underground nor a railroad? Okay. What do you want to know, Annie? That this was basically a network of people. Now, there's actually a book that I read a couple summers ago called The Underground Railroad, and there's actually an underground railroad. Like it's actually like a train that goes through tunnels underground that helps slaves get to freedom. But this was pretty much a network of people who were helping slaves to escape to Canada, really, because now some of them stopped in the North and just went that route. But remember, according to the Fugitive Slave Act, until somebody got to Canada, that wasn't necessarily, I mean, it's just they're not necessarily safe. So a lot of people were going to Canada. Some stopped, when they got to the North, but it was just, the depots per se. Somebody like Harriet Tubman would lead people, through a state like Ohio, which Cincinnati's where they've got the Harriet Tubman Museum. And so she would lead people through there. And then you have these depots, which are houses where, some of these runaway slaves can spend the night. So it was just a network of people helping people to get out. That is a great question, and I'm not exactly sure about that, Perla, but you could Google that. That's going to be beyond the scope of the exam, I would believe. All right. So as far as that goes, let me just take a look here. All right. Well, yeah, we're on our way. And what caused the secession of the southern states? Now, the immediate cause, the immediate catalyst, if we want to use a scientific term, was the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And when you read the secession declarations, some of them have more grievances than others. Pretty much all of them, do in the deep South at least. Okay, so we've got to, if we're looking at secession, we need to look at the deep South, and then we need to look at the upper South. So when you look at the Mississippi Secession Declaration, it pretty much starts off like point one, slavery. We think that basically the Republican Party is going to be a threat to slavery in the United States, and therefore, and they've got some other reasons too. I mean, a lot of times people say, oh, well, it says here in the Mississippi Declaration that it's about slavery, so I can just stop reading. Well, there's some other things that they go into, but the main thing, they put it out there first and foremost, just there you go. So now that would be the Deep South and the reasons for seceding. Now, then the Upper South. Okay, so when you look at the Upper South, the states like Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, that before Lincoln called for troops to come to invade the South after Fort Sumter, those states weren't going to secede. So you do have to understand that there were some states that seceded because they believed that the military action was unconstitutional, and that kind of pushed them over the edge. That it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy that people thought, oh, Lincoln's going to come after slavery. And so then they secede, and then Fort Sumter's attacked, and then Lincoln, sends, excuse me, Lincoln raises an army. And so you do want to distinguish between the Deep South and the Upper South there. But, the immediate, cause there being the election of Abraham Lincoln. But looking at like a Deep South secession declaration like that of Mississippi would be a worthy inquiry for you. So, which those are, if you just type in, so Mississippi Secession Declaration. Okay, so let's see what we've got here. All right. All right. And then you've got, a lot of this, let's see. So, the Mississippi Secession Declaration is one you see, but then, remember that is a Deep South Secession Declaration. If you look at Arkansas, you'll find something a little bit different there. And so we're finished answering that. Okay. Do I think that Honest Abe would have, the thing is, Brandon, let me talk about the Emancipation Proclamation in a second. But here's the thing. The Emancipation Proclamation escalated the war. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation in September, which was 100 days before January 1st of 1863. So one thing to understand about the Civil War is a limited war. Okay, so here's the thing. Like, I wish I had a board in front of me or something like that, because the Deep South secedes over slavery, largely. Okay, so Deep South secedes over slavery, largely, forms the Confederate States of America, sends commissioners to offer to pay for Fort Sumter and all of that, to hand it over peacefully, and those commissioners are rebuffed. The Davis administration decides to attack Fort Sumter. Now, Lincoln then raises an army to invade the South. And so as far as that goes, that was not a decision motivated by slavery. That was a decision motivated by secession, which he considered illegal and a rebellion. So this is why a lot of people like to have this dichotomous kind of talk, like, was the Civil War about slavery or was it about states' rights? And, it's really, and your APUSH concept outline says that there are multiple causes for this. Okay, so originally secession is in defense of the Deep South, in defense of slavery. Then Lincoln, raises an army to fight against secession. And then the Upper South secedes in protest of Lincoln's fighting a war against the Deep South. And so as far as that goes, like, Abraham Lincoln is the whole time, now even after 1863, Abraham Lincoln's goal is to preserve the Union. That's what he said from day one. He never said anything different. Now, another thing is, if you think about Reconstruction, was Abraham Lincoln pushing for African American equality? No, he was saying, okay, look, if you want to come back into the Union, you got to get rid of slavery. Now, what you do with the African American population's up to you, because remember, Dred Scott, the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court said that people of African descent could not be citizens of the United States. And so with that, when the 13th Amendment was passed, then, basically these people who were freed, they're not slaves, but they are not citizens necessarily. That's where the black codes come in. And so if the war would have stopped, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation 100 days before he issued the real one. And it was really a warning to the South. Like, if the Civil War would have ended like December 31st, 1862, absolutely. Abraham Lincoln would have just said, all right, you get back to business, we'll get back to business. But after 1863, then it's a different story. Okay, so just understand that for Lincoln, the primary motivation for fighting the Civil War was to fight against secession, not in order to eradicate slavery, which is a goal that he added later. So the North's war aims, end up changing a bit. So with that, now the Kansas-Nebraska Act was written by, was sponsored by Stephen Douglas of Illinois, of course, who debated Lincoln in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Now, yeah, I'm glad to go into detail, and thank y'all for coming tonight. We've got a pretty good crowd. This is good. I think we had about 15 or 20 last time. It's good when we've got a big crowd like this because we get more questions. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, really, the Compromise of 1850 was really kind of a turning point, because before the Mexican-American War, before 1848, what had happened was you have a slave state, free state, slave state, free state, slave state, free state. Actually, the thing is that mass colonization never happened. Let me be clear about this colonization thing that I see in the chat, okay? Mass colonization never happened. Lincoln, did y'all write the DBQ on African Americans in the Civil War? Is that where y'all are getting this? Because there's a document about that, okay? But the thing is, Lincoln, as late as 1862, advocated colonization as a solution to the slavery problem, because Lincoln, like by today, y'all hear this term white nationalist. Lincoln, by the standards of that time, by the standards of our time, was a white nationalist. Like, he believed, and that was basically the consensus in white America at the time, whether North or South. So Lincoln advocated colonization as a solution to the slavery problem, but he never went through a process of colonization. That never happened, although he was an advocate for it. And that tended to be how people thought, because they had never seen a society before then where people of different races and ethnicities could live on equal terms with each other in one society. So that's something that I just wanted to address that here, that, while Lincoln was an advocate of colonization as late as 1862, there wasn't actually a massive colonization scheme. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, sorry, went on a little rabbit trail there, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act was written by Stephen Douglas, and this is in the 1850s. So this is, if I'm not mistaken, 1853, 54, something like that, ballpark, right? The Compromise of 1850, like after the Mexican Cession, all right? So during the Mexican War, you had the Wilmot Proviso. So before the Wilmot Proviso and the Free Soil Movement, slave state, free state, slave state, free state, slave state, free state. And so before the West really becomes a thing, it was just kind of in this thing where there was an equal number of slave states and free states. Now, the Compromise of 1850 kind of turns that on its head, because the Free Soilers, like the Wilmot Proviso, which never passed, but it was proposed and had a lot of support in Congress. The Wilmot Proviso said that we're not going to have no slavery in any territories acquired from Mexico. And so that was the line that the Free Soilers drew here. And so then, they decided on this popular sovereignty thing. Okay, so when they did the Compromise of 1850, they admitted California as a free state without having a slave state brought in with it. But then they decided, okay, let's do, and again, I've got a video out now on the Compromise of 1850. Y'all should take a look at it on my YouTube channel. And so as far as that is concerned, so the Compromise of 1850 is passed, and you have popular sovereignty in the Mexican Cession. Now, Stephen Douglas helped Henry Clay pass the Compromise of 1850, and what he's thinking about is, now we can apply this popular sovereignty doctrine in Kansas and Nebraska and these territories that were being made in the Louisiana Purchase. Now, this basically went back on the Missouri Compromise. And that's the big problem here, is that in the 1850s, you start to see here that a compromise that had already been made was gone back on. Okay, so it was backpedaled. And, you know, then it's like, okay, well, what now? And this really infuriated people. And you had Bleeding Kansas and all of that. And Stephen Douglas, you know, was just like, hey, I mean, he was a Northern Democrat, so he needed Southern support in order to run for president. He had presidential aspirations. And so this was kind of a way to sort of create like maybe like a Trojan horse for slavery in the territories. But remember that Kansas and Nebraska, they were both north of the 3630 line. So these were supposed to be free territories, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act made them subject to popular sovereignty. And so you've got people from the pro-slavery and anti-slavery camps that are setting up settlements in Kansas. And so that's where you've got Bleeding Kansas, because the Civil War starts over there. Small scale. I mean, only about 50 to 60 people died, but still. But they've got these people killing each other out there, and both of those groups of settlers is trying to do, bring Kansas in as a slave state or a free state. And you even got, at the time the Civil War starts, Kansas, there were two constitutions submitted: the Lecompton Constitution, which was the Lecompton Constitution, which was the pro-slavery Constitution, and the Topeka Constitution, which was the anti-slavery Constitution, which, of course, today we know that Topeka is the capital of Kansas. All right, so the Topeka one was what was adopted, but it was after secession. So as far as that goes, let's see what we've got here. All right, so what did the Emancipation Proclamation really do? Now, the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln said this as a war measure, okay? This is a war measure. And you've got to understand that really the Confederacy, now we look at the resources that the North had versus the South. And the North definitely had more money, they had more manufacturing, they had more people, but the Confederacy, they didn't have to conquer the North, okay? So it's like the Union had to conquer the Confederacy, whereas all the Confederacy had to do was to get the North to give up the will to fight. And it's kind of like if we think about Vietnam, it's like Charlie certainly was not as well armed as we were, but Charlie was able to wear down our will to fight, and the American people stopped supporting the war. And so that's all the Confederacy needed to do. So Lincoln really, it's like the Emancipation Proclamation was somewhat of an act of desperation, because, the Confederates, especially now in the West, the Union was really like just handing it to the Confederacy time and time again. But in the East, in Virginia, the Confederates were putting up a very strong resistance. And so Lincoln believed that, before that, what they were doing was they were confiscating slaves and putting them to work on Union lines, like treating slaves as contraband. But Lincoln said, okay, we're going to free slaves as we go in there. Now, the immediate effect was not very significant, because it did not apply to the border states. It did not apply to areas where the Union was in control. So by January 1st, 1863, the Union actually controlled like occupied all of the state of Tennessee and some of Tidewater, Virginia, and then some of coastal like South Carolina, and I don't know if that was included, but Southeast Louisiana was included in the Emancipation Proclamation. So let's see here. So we're Emancipation Proclamation. Let me see if I can find that map here. All right, so let's see what we've got here. Okay, yes, I've got something here. All right, so let's see. All right, going to go ahead and share my screen with y'all for just a second to kind of show y'all what I've got here. Okay. All right. So as far as that goes, you've got, so none of the border states are impacted. All right, because those border states are part of the Union. Then there are these coastal counties in Virginia that weren't included. And then we see Southeast Louisiana, which was occupied by the Union after the conquest of New Orleans. So those areas weren't affected. So basically, Lincoln, in the proclamation, it's only in states and territories that are in rebellion against the United States. Now, the thing is, immediately, not a very significant effect. But as the Union Army advanced, that is when we see, okay, now that the Union Army's advancing, they're freeing slaves as they go. So when somebody says the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free a single slave, that's a bit of a stretch, actually a lot of a stretch, because as the Union Army would advance, they would go and they would read the Emancipation Proclamation, and so that would go from there. So the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in basically Confederate slaves in places that weren't under Union control as of January 1st, 1863. And remember, like, if you think about it, like, there was a strategic idea for this too, because somebody who's a slaveholder in Tennessee, they're thinking, you know what, I don't want to help the Confederacy right now because then they'll come and take my slaves from me. So, if I'm in Southwest Louisiana, somebody's like, hey, I want your sugar crop because we need to buy some stuff for the Confederacy. And I'd be like, you know what, no, I can't really risk my livelihood here to help the Confederacy because, my plantation here is protected by the Union right now. So that's that. Now, as far as Liberia, I wouldn't use the word deported for Liberia. Like, let me go ahead and do that as a question. Okay. So let's just make sure, like, the American Colonization Society, I would not call that deportation. Okay. Deportation is when you forcibly remove someone from a country, whereas the American Colonization Society sent back maybe tens of thousands. Not, I mean, you think about, there were millions of slaves in the United States at the time, but they sent home, like, they sent freed people of color who had, on a voluntary basis, and it was never a very large scale operation because it never had government support. The American Colonization Society relied on charitable donations to pay for the passage for these families back to Africa. So while it was something that was done, it was never done in mass. Okay, now of course you'll run into Marcus Garvey later on and the Black Star Line. Marcus Garvey, who was a black man who had his own ideas of bringing black people back to Africa and starting an African nation there. So as far as that, just want to make that clear. How effective was popular sovereignty? Now, popular sovereignty, it went over really without a hitch in Utah and New Mexico because that takes a long time to get over there. So that didn't start the same kind of frenzy. Now, the thing is, popular sovereignty was then tried in Kansas and Nebraska, and it was a disaster in Kansas because it led to people killing each other. John Brown and his sons hacking somebody to pieces with a broadsword. Like, I'm not making this up. Look it up. Like, John Brown killed a man, like, with a broadsword, hacked the guy to pieces. I mean, it was just wow. So there's some really, like, gruesome stuff going on there. So I would say definitely in Kansas, that was not something that went over very well, but because of people going over there, Beecher's Bibles, all of that kind of stuff. All right. Now, as far as the consequences of the Emancipation Proclamation, that you do see that the Union is freeing slaves after that. One of the biggest things is it strengthened the Union's moral ground. It gave the Union the moral high ground. And the Union was able to advertise this because the Confederates were trying to get recognition. I mean, the Confederacy, like, by all appearances, I mean, they had a government, they had a Congress, they had a president, they had a military. This wasn't just some kind of like ragtag, like Fidel Castro rebellion kind of operation like you saw in Cuba, where they were out in the jungles and such fighting a guerrilla war. The Confederacy was, it was unrecognized. Like, it actually had a working government and a constitution and all that, but it wasn't recognized by Britain or France or anybody really that important. And so what happened is after the Emancipation Proclamation, it made it much more difficult for Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy, and they never did. And before you can get help, you have to get recognized. And so the Confederacy was hoping that maybe we can get some help from Britain because they import our cotton. Now, Britain at the same time was finding new places, new sources of cotton, so they weren't needing the Confederacy as much anymore. Let's see. Now, the thing is, the question about Southern politics, I see it got 5 upvotes, Lauren, but it lacks specificity. I really don't know how to answer that question because it's not very specific. Zoe, the Reconstruction amendments, we'll do Reconstruction over the holidays. We'll do that after Thanksgiving. Now, I'm not going to be broadcasting next week because we're going to be on Thanksgiving break, but I will be back in 2 weeks. Make sure, again, go take a look at my YouTube channel. I've got a video on the Compromise of 1850. Will y'all go ahead and tell me in the chat, is there a video that I could make for Fiveable, like a quick something that I could explain? Like, tell me what might work. If y'all have got any kind of suggestions for like something I could explain real quick or something like that. Okay, so as far as that goes, it looks like here that the majority, about half of you that are in here studying the Civil War right now, nobody's gotten a Reconstruction, even though I did get a question about the amendments, so I'm wondering about that. But we will be looking at the Civil War and Reconstruction as we go into December, and then we will be getting into midterm review. Okay, we need to talk, like next time we come back, I need to find out how many of your midterms are before Christmas break and how many of you have midterms after Christmas break. So ladies and gentlemen, I will see y'all in 2 weeks, and thank y'all for coming tonight. Hopefully y'all found the session helpful. And remember that if your teacher, okay, I'll definitely consider that. Okay, so your teacher, make sure that if your teacher has not purchased Fiveable or you haven't, at some point these free reviews are going to become less common, and it's going to be a subscriber only thing in the spring. So y'all just keep that in mind. I love you too, Annie. And y'all have a wonderful night, and I will see y'all again in 2 weeks. It's always a pleasure.